to have been asked to chair this meeting on behalf of ex-Celeste Unity and the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition. Just quickly run through the agenda before we make a start. First of all, after my opening remarks, Edd Pott, the parliamentary candidate for Left Unity and the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition, will be giving a talk for 20 minutes just to introduce himself and his ideas. We'll then have about 15 minutes for a question and answer open floor discussion. Edd Pott, councillor candidate for St Thomas Ward, will then have a 5-minute contribution on our migration policies, and then there'll be another 10 minutes for questions and discussion. And we'll then close the meeting, so hopefully this will last about an hour. That's the idea. This meeting is being held in the face of a pretty uncertain government at the moment. It seems very likely that we're going to have a hung parliament and a coalition government, which means basically excuse for broken manifesto policies. That seems to be what's happened in the last 5 years, and we can expect more of the same in the next 5. A coalition led by either the Tories or the Labour Party is likely to, or is certain to, carry on implementing the austerity policies, the cut to public services, and that we've seen in the last 5 years, and which so many people hate so much. And it's more and more it's becoming a bit of a popularity contest between the main figureheads of the parties, with so many members of society completely misinformed, both by the people in Westminster and by the mainstream media, as to the right decision to make, whether the way they understand the way the economy works. But we're seeing that politics is changing, and that there is a rise in the small parties, and this is obviously linked to the fact that there is likely to be a hung parliament in the next government. There's a growing anger amongst many sort of sections of the people here at what the government are doing to the public services, saying, oh, we're all in this together, whilst they're cutting funds to public services, things like the NHS, whilst at the same time bailing out the bankers and giving tax breaks to big businesses, multinational businesses. And this anger is growing, and we're hoping to capitalise on this anger. We need to capitalise on this anger in society. And we're standing here today as a socialist organisation. We stand for socialism, we stand for social equality, complete equality. And that's the entire idea of what we stand for. And again, there's been a huge amount of misinformation in the last number of decades by the media and by politicians about what socialism actually means. They often brand people as communists even when they're talking about Stalinism, and that's not what we're standing here for today. I'm sure many of you are aware that that's not what we mean, but again, that's just an example of the misinformation. So we're standing here today as a coalition of a number of left parties, of trade unionists, of political activists, and Edd Pott has been elected to represent us in the political, in the parliamentary elections coming up. And becoming a well-known face in Exeter. He's made some serious waves at a number of the hustings events in Exeter. Some of you may have heard him already. And so with that, I'd like to introduce him. So he'll be speaking for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session for you all. Ed.
Well, thanks very much, Luke, and thanks everyone for coming. It's good to see so many new faces. For those who don't know me already, I'm Ed. I'm 23 years old. I've lived in Exeter a few years now. I've been politically active, been going on 4 years, I think. I'm actually incredibly proud to be representing the socialist movement in this country. It's something that I never thought I'd find myself in this sort of situation. And I'm also very proud to serve as the sort of public face of our local campaign. Got a fantastic group of activists here, and what I would just say is, this campaign's taken me in, places that I never expected to be, in front of TV cameras, speaking to journalists, all kinds of stuff where, I'm sort of so nervous, my hands are trembling, but it's actually about much more than that. I mean, it gets our message out there, but it's about much more than that. It's about the people who, go out every day and do the, small acts of kindness and small acts of sort of mutual solidarity in society, which help make the world a better place, whether that's serving food in a food kitchen, or it's helping the food bank, helping community organisations, telling friends about what's going on in society, designing leaflets. All of these things get done behind the scenes. So I just want to say it's that really don't want to take all the credit for what's going on. In terms of why I'm here and why I'm standing for election and why I'm a socialist, I mean, I guess I've long since forgotten why when I became a socialist. I mean, looking back, maybe it was sort of 2003 when you had a Labour government who went back on their promise to renationalise the railways. They introduced tuition fees when they said they wouldn't. They privatised the NHS and no one saw that coming, and then capped it all off by taking us into an illegal war in the face of massive public opposition. Now, definitely I came from a sort of old Labour type household. Maybe many of you have voted Labour, or definitely know people that do. And it leads you to the realisation that something's wrong, and the people who we thought were our friends, maybe there's something deeper going on here, that actually, the people who are meant to represent us aren't actually doing that anymore. Fast forwarding in time, maybe it was in 2010 when we had the Tory Liberal government who, first year I started university, wouldn't you know it, they decided they were going to triple the tuition fees. And what we sort of thought was, well, if a promise, a cast iron pledge by the Deputy Prime Minister before the election isn't worth the paper it's written on, maybe actually voting for these people won't solve anything. Maybe we have to be on the streets telling people what's going on, protesting about it, and maybe that's the way you achieve change. So, it was a very sort of uncertain time, and I was angry. I think we were all angry about what was going on, even within the first few months of this current government coming in. So, in terms of what it means to be a socialist, you often get accused of, when people look at your policies, say, the taxing the rich, and redistributing wealth in society, people look at you and say, oh, it's the politics of envy, or, you just hate people who are successful. But actually, if you think about it, I think the opposite's true. I think it's the people who sit in their ivory towers, sit in the Houses of Commons, sit in the boardrooms of FTSE 100 companies. I think it's them who hate us. I think, to sit on the amount of wealth that they do, while the use of food banks is growing in this country, while we're seeing spiralling poverty and inequality, all of these things, to sit on that amount of wealth. Of course, we saw in the past week or so a study that showed that 1% of the UK's population own the same amount as wealth as the poorest 55% of us. So if you think about it, at virtually no cost to themselves, they could give away half their wealth. They would still be fantastically wealthy, never want for anything until the day they die. They could give that much away. We would all be much, much richer. We would see the use of food banks would become a thing of the past. Child poverty and hunger among children would become something that we only read about in history books. But it doesn't happen. That kind of act of charity or kindness just doesn't figure on their radar. And so I think it leads you to it leads me anyway to a different conclusion, which is that it's not just about wealth. It's not just about whether our top rate of tax is 45% or 50% or however you want to set the bar. It's actually about a question of power. It's about a tiny minority in society who hold most of the wealth, who hold most of the power, who have political parties that they trot out to represent them, but who stand for more or less the same thing. It's about monopolising power in this country. It's about denying us, people like us, access to what we need in order to get by, what we need in order to better ourselves. So the attacks that we've seen are, very ideologically driven. It's not, obviously, I hope everyone agrees here that we aren't cutting public services because they need to be cut. We can definitely find the money. For instance, Trident, our nuclear weapons submarine system, to save the £100 billion that could be saved by not renewing that, could pay for accident and emergency services in the NHS for the next 40 years. So it's not like we can't find the money. And it's not even a case of just misdirected priorities, maybe they haven't thought of directing money where it needs to be. It's actually a question of what do we need money to be spent on in order to improve our lives, improve our communities, improve our standards of living, so that we actually have pride and dignity, and we can actually move forward as a society as a whole, as the majority in society, because we are, we're the majority. People like us constitute the majority, and it's a very, very small elite who own most of the property, most of the wealth, have most of the power. So this is what I see behind the attacks on our services, especially things like libraries, which are now Devon County Council, you might see, has proposed hiving them off to some sort of mutual that they're going to be run, which is obviously a sort of smokescreen for cuts to come. It's the reason that they attack things like the NHS, which, by the way, in my opinion, is actually a sort of microcosm of how a society should be run. Because when you go into a hospital and you need treatment, no one asks you to produce your debit card or to get a credit rating check before you go in there, because it's run for people, not for profit. And we've been pushed so far back that actually we've lost that sort of argument that things should be run for people and not for profit. And it doesn't matter whether it turns a profit or not. It doesn't matter, how much money it takes in order to keep people healthy and to serve people who are in desperate need. So what we want to do by standing in this election, by having a platform and reaching as many people as we can, hopefully a lot of you will have seen our leaflet and that's how you come to be here tonight. What we want to do is advance an argument for a very, very different sort of society. So, I mean, obviously with the socialism, well, what does that mean? Obviously, as I've said, it means a massive redistribution of wealth and power. But how are we going to achieve that? We think that the answer lies in pushing back not only against how much should different rates of tax be, how much funding should different things get, but actually pushing for things where we own in common what we need. So we are pushing for public ownership of the railways and the transport system, the major utilities, the banks, all of these things that affect our lives in any number of ways. We pay for them, we pay to keep them running, and yet we have no control over how they're run. Now, I mean, I hope everyone's in agreement here, but actually, it can feel very lonely to be a socialist or to lean that way and think that there's something really wrong with society. It can feel really lonely because you feel like you're mad because the viewpoints that we hold to are kind of excluded from the media. They don't get a look in on the beat, daily politics, all this sort of thing, and they're not represented in the House of Commons due to our chronically unfair voting system, which excludes minorities. So it can feel like you're in a tiny minority, but I'd just like to draw your attention, for instance, to a report of a poll done by YouGov, which is, a professional organisation designed, and their business is finding out what people think on the major issues. What they said was that between 70 and 75% of people, on average, across the country, support public ownership of transport, of energy, gas, electricity, water. Even a good chunk of, 40-45% of us think that banks should be in public hands. And so actually, the general public, us, are well to the left of any party that's in Westminster, really. And it's a question of when we get a party that represents us. So it's coming from that feeling that not only is no one really listening, but actually there's no one who's even remotely, in tune with what we want. There's no one who's even on the same page as us, to be honest. And that's what we hope to achieve. We'd like to build, going forwards, a campaigning organisation here which can address these things, not only on a national level, dealing with the sort of the general things, that you deal with when you stand in an election, but also in the local things. I mean, like South West Water, for instance. I mean, I hope we'd all agree that water's, something that we all rely on. It's a collective good, and we all pay for it. So, to look into the accounts of South West Water, and see that we're paying the highest water rates of just about anywhere in the country, and yet their directors, the people who own it and run, right at the top, are taking home six-figure salaries. How can that be right, that we're subsidising that? Similar story with Stagecoach. So what we'd like to do is to reach, you and all of the people that that agree with you about these things, who aren't being represented, who don't get a look in, and actually build an organisation that unites all of us, that can campaign for these things, that can bring about change in our society. We're starting off small. It's very difficult. Standing in elections, for example, is expensive. But we're proud of what we've achieved so far. Last year we stood council candidates. This year, obviously, we've managed to run a parliamentary campaign as well, which gets you into debates. It gets you heard. It gets you in the newspaper now and then. But we actually think if we start to tap into the massive well of people in society who agree with us, then we'll really start going places. So that's partly why we've invited you here tonight, because we think, obviously, if you agree with what we're saying, then we want you to be involved. We want to hear your input. We want to have, we want your ideas on how we can actually advance these these principles and these ideas in society. There's also an added element to it as well, which is that we all represent a community in Exeter, which is, we're losing track of the idea of communities, in my opinion. We're being encouraged to look inwards as a society, inwards into ourselves as individuals, and away from the idea of being a collective who help each other, who assist each other when we're in need. I think there's nothing more. There's no more obvious example of that than in the scapegoating of very vulnerable people in society by the coalition government, and unfortunately by some people in the Labour Party who want to blame certain groups in society for the problems that we're facing. Two examples of this I would give are immigrants and people in the welfare system who are claiming benefits of some kind. So obviously I'll leave the question of migration and and that's mostly today because it's something he has a lot of experience of dealing with and talking to people about. But what we've seen, unfortunately, and this is a prime example for me of the new sort of consensus emerging around the main parties, is what we've seen in the past couple of months is Rachel Reeves of the Labour Party saying, we do not want to, this is Labour she's talking about, we do not want to be seen as the party of people who are claiming benefits. That's not who we want to represent. And you just have to wonder, don't you? We've gone so far that people like that don't even think twice before saying something so obnoxious. I mean, it shows a sort of complete lack of regard for who Labour was set up to represent. Because actually, most people who claim benefits are in work. People who claim benefits most of the time are not unemployed, they're not the stereotype of sitting around at home. They're actually in work and they're not getting what they need in order to fulfil themselves and have a decent life. You see it, and we've been pushed so far back with these, the sort of the right wing and the people who are against change or against a collective sort of progress for the good of all of us. They're being allowed to control the agenda. We had a stall out in the high street, and we had a poster saying £10 an hour minimum wage, which is one of our policies, because wages have been held back since the financial crisis, and they've gone down in real terms. We're not actually getting what we need in order to have a decent life anymore. And he walked past and he said, "That'll bankrupt the country, that will." And we sort of, what? Okay, what? And then he sort of came back, "That'll bankrupt the country. Do you employ people?" No, we don't employ people. He said, "Well, I employ 150 people, and that will bankrupt the country." And of course, what he meant was, it'll bankrupt him. He didn't, when people say the country like that, they mean it'll bankrupt me or people like me. It's not actually true, by the way, that it'll bankrupt him, because obviously what he's saying is that he wants to employ 150 people, and he wants to employ them £6.25, which is the minimum wage for over 21s, and or however much he does pay them, and therefore he doesn't want to pay people enough to live. What that means, though, is that those people are underpaid. I'm underpaid. I get a bit more than that, but I'm still underpaid. And he wants to have those people earning that amount of money. They're then underpaid, they're poor, and what it means is they then have to claim housing benefit to be able to afford their rent, working tax credits, child benefit to afford the things their children need, all of these things. And what it means is that the rest of us who pay for those benefits are then topping up their wages. So when he says, "I don't think we can afford to pay them £10 an hour minimum wage," what he's saying is, I think everyone else should be forced to do it. Now, we've been pushed so far back that we don't even recognise that it should be, wages should be something that allow you to get the basics of what you need in order to get by, in order to have a decent style of living. And it's actually about pushing back on that and having the organisations at your disposal which can help you get that. So I mean, the role of trade unions, I think, is incredibly important as well, because obviously since Thatcher and carried on by the Labour governments that followed her, what we've had is anti-trade union laws which shackle the unions, which means they can't negotiate properly on our behalf, they can't negotiate for better conditions or higher wages, and if you want to go on strike because the boss has forced you into it, you can't, because the law prevents you from doing so in 99% of cases. And so this is really where we come up against it. Some people have said, "Well, why aren't you working within the Labour Party?" This is it, because whenever we get a Labour government, not only do you get the incredibly obnoxious people like Rachel Reeves slagging off the poor, slagging off the people who are most vulnerable, but you also get things like refusing to repeal the anti-trade union laws, which means that not only will they not introduce change for us at the top in the House of Commons, but they won't let us bring about change together either. And I think that's the real issue. That's the reason we're all here. That's the reason we're being forced to seek out an alternative. So, as I said, I'm really keen to hear all your ideas about how we can, pursue the sort of change that we want. Maybe you've got other ideas as well that we haven't addressed yet, about what needs to change in society, and really keen to hear that too. Let's go for that.